Today on the podcast, we have part 5 in our series, Screenwriting with Walt. This is the story of Walt Disney and Larry Watkin as the Disney studio in the 1950s works to transform itself from a modest animation company to a major studio that produces live-action movies, TV, and even has its own amusement park. In looking over Walt's life, it's clear that Walt wanted to move his studio in new directions in 1939 and 1940. He explored building a themed visitor center and park on the Burbank studio lot. This story is discussed in our series on Herb Ryman. He also formed a company with Bing Crosby to create something similar to New York's Madison Square Garden, only in Los Angeles. That story is told over on Bandcamp in a 4-part album called Walt's First Park. Both of these projects had their own issues, but one of the largest reasons they fell apart was the timing. America was slowly moving toward World War II during these years. The war also meant that many European markets were closed to American films, which meant that some Disney movies lost money, such as Fantasia, while others, such as Pinocchio, barely made a profit. It wasn't until the late 1940s and 1950s that Walt and his studio were on sure financial footing where such expansion could then take place. During Walt's lifetime, the pictures he created with screenwriter Larry Watkin were some of his best-known offerings, films that were regularly re-released and then later showed up on the Disney TV series. If you were born anywhere between 1940 and 1980, these films, for you, were likely as well known as Snow White or Lady and the Tramp. It is through these early efforts with Larry Watkin that Walt teaches himself how to develop live action with a Disney touch, and also how to compete directly with studios like Warner Brothers and Paramount. We've already looked at early projects that Disney filmed in the UK, such as Treasure Island and Robin Hood. And today we'll primarily take a look at 2 films. First, a project that interested Walt for decades, a screen adaptation of the epic novel Don Quixote, a project that would never come to completion at the Disney studio. Walt first tried to adapt this film in the late 1930s using story artists who developed materials for animation. Walt tried again in the 1950s with Larry Watkin, looking at a live-action film this time that would be made with A-list stars. The second film we'll look at today is The Great Locomotive Chase. This was a film starring Fess Parker, who in 1955, when this picture was shot, was one of the most famous actors in America, following his tremendous success playing Davy Crockett for Disney. All through these experiences, Watkin comes to know Walt better and also develops theories as to how Walt understood the idea of story, particularly as it relates to the movies. And so now, if you're ready, let's kick in to part 5. Though Larry Watkin was moved from project to project, he continually returned to the Darby O'Gill stories, as this was the project that began his career at Disney. It was also a project that deeply interested Walt, one that, like his best-known animated features, was based on folk or fairy tales. Years earlier, Watkin had completed a full draft of this screenplay. He had also given the project a new name, calling it 3 Wishes. At one point, the studio announced that the Leprechaun project would combine animation and live action, and that the live action sequences would be filmed in Ireland. Though as Walt became more familiar with live-action production, he understood that with special effects, unique lenses, well-designed sets, matte paintings, and inventive lighting configurations, he might create a live-action film with realistic banshees and leprechauns without relying on animation and arranging the project with 2 visual modes. An entirely live-action production would give the film one overall visual tone, which would ideally make the world in the film seem a little more real to viewers. By this point, Watkin understood that Walt had two modes for script development. Some scripts, such as Treasure Island and Robin Hood, were developed straight through, draft after draft, with the goal of filming the story 6 months after Watkin began writing. These projects needed to be protected to meet deadlines and release dates, but other projects, such as Darby O'Gill, were developed outside of a firm timeline. It was as though Walt wanted to protect these projects for errors or from a lack of depth that sometimes plagued a script developed too quickly, or as though Walt felt that these stories had the potential to reach higher levels of creativity and accomplishment than a typical film if only they were given enough space to be developed. Watkin returned to the Darby O'Gill stories many times, picking up the script, changing its scenes and set pieces, and then putting it down when he was assigned another deadline-dependent project. After The Sword and the Rose, Watkin again was able to spend time with the Darby stories. As before, Watkin understood that this project had cultural importance. He was translating traditional Irish folk tales for a modern audience. He also understood that it was one of Walt's special projects. As these pictures progressed, Watkin himself was slowly ushered into Walt's inner circle, a position where he helped Walt shape and create films. In previous writing assignments at other studios, Watkin had been valued for his literary depth and his complex, realistic characters. At times, Watkin found that these literary skills were valued at the Disney studio as well. But Walt's interests were wide-ranging. At times he was drawn to films destined to win awards, and at times he was drawn to lower-cost films that satisfied middle American appetites for wholesome entertainment. Watkin found that his work at Disney's stretched him. It forced him to look beyond traditional narrative structures as they were defined inside of novels and classrooms, and instead consider ways to believably integrate more fanciful concepts into the familiar structure of a 90-minute film. As Watkin moved from script to script, he came to understand Walt's tastes. The comic characters were innocently resourceful and tinged with malice, and the villains were terrifying but not loathsome. Examples of both could be found in Treasure Island. Jim Hawkins, the hero, was innocent and mischievous. Long John Silver, its villain, was mutinous and power-hungry, but still had a soft spot for the young Jim. As the RKO Disney British films were released, Watkin came to believe that Walt had the ability to understand the desires of Middle America, impressions that he couldn't always articulate with words. Sometimes Walt was unable to explain why he felt as he did, Watkin said, but Walt's impressions were usually right. Watkin also came to believe that his own strengths, largely literary and academic, were balanced by those that Walt possessed. At times, Walt dismissed formal education by saying, "Education is too important to be left to educators." But Watkin knew that Walt would have given his eye teeth for a college education. Walt was an avid reader, always interested in talking to new people and understanding their perspectives. He was a person who, for his entire adult life, worked to expand his mind and his understanding of the world far beyond his formal 8th grade education. Instead of 20,000 Leagues, Walt offered Watkin a project that he had long wanted to bring to the screen. First in animation, and then later as a live-action fantasy, an adaptation of the 17th century Spanish epic novel Don Quixote. Quixote was a philosophical novel, focused on a man who imagines his life to be something far more than it is, a life tied to the historic period of knights and chivalry. From the start, Watkin understood that this was an important story for Walt, one that had interested him for years. This was another of those projects, like the Darby O'Gill stories, that Walt would develop and redevelop over years until he found the exact right script. In his office, Walt explained the history of the project at the Disney studio, how studio artists had previously approached it, the idea to adapt the 1,000-page novel of Don Quixote by Miguel de Cervantes to the screen had existed at the studio for about 15 years. Story artists such as Mel Shaw and Eduardo Solofranco had boarded out many scenes in 1939 and 1940. In their hands, Quixote would either be an animated feature or an animated feature with sections of live action. The story of a man who longs to battle dragons and talk with kings, only to be brought back to his relatively average life. The artistic style of the film was influenced by Mediterranean painters El Greco and Velázquez, both of whom lived roughly at the same time when the novel was written. One early plan placed live-action sections in black and white, while saving the Technicolor sections for the animated fantasy, similar to the tonal structure of MGM's The Wizard of Oz. But the epic novel, with all of its adventures, secondary characters, and side plots, proved too convoluted for Disney's story team to wrestle into a feature-length presentation, even if the two main characters, Don Quixote and Sancho Panza, were ideal for a Disney film. The story team back then kept removing episodic subplots from the novel, searching for a narrative line that would form a story arc suitable for a film. Following the pattern of Snow White and Pinocchio, story artists looked for a linear line of action that would develop ongoing tension leading to a culminating scene and a memorable finale. They imagined a dream sequence in which Don Quixote briefly found the larger life he longed for, but as his vision cleared, he was returned to the smallness of his actual life. For a novel, this pattern might have worked in print, but as a visual drama, it lacked the transformative ending that viewers typically found in a Disney film. Though story artists a decade or so earlier never assembled a workable treatment, Walt now thought that Watkin might be able to accomplish this. Watkin likely understood that the material from Don Quixote might lend itself more to a fully live-action production, as deeply talented actors, compared to animated characters, might be able to better express the nuanced emotions of the novel. Walt told me something that had my tongue hanging out, Watkin added. Cary Grant wanted to play Quixote. Walt then floated the idea of hiring the popular Mexican comedian Cantinflas to play Don Quixote's sidekick, Sancho Panza. It was almost surely an ideal fit of casting for these two characters, Grant with his eccentric and likable confusion, and Cantinflas with his Chaplin-esque visual humor. Watkin worked with the original novel, a story that would need to lose about 90% of its bulk to fit the shape of a feature film. He also relied on an illustrated history of the novel, how various artists had represented it for centuries. On a Disney expense account, Watkin visited Spain with his wife Dot to better understand the environment where the story was set. Disney executives arranged for Watkin to be assisted by David Ley, a British professor who worked at the University of Madrid. Ley would help Watkin understand the cultural nuances of the novel as it related to Spain during the early years of the 17th century. To do this, they traveled the breadth of central and southern Spain. I love the primitive La Mancha plain, Watkin said. In the heat of the day, when only mad Americans and an Englishman would be driving around in the glare of the midday sun, we would pass a newly plowed field with perfectly straight dark brown furrows, which ended when we came upon the plowman, stretched out upon the ground with his sombrero covering his face as he took his siesta in the shadow cast by his patient mule. Watkin produced one story treatment, then another, trying to find a way to shape the material for a movie. Because of the episodic nature of the story, Watkin, like the Disney story teams before him, struggled to find a cinematic through-line that would shape Cervantes' imagination for a modern movie audience. "I kept seeing Cary Grant with his haunted eyes," Watkin said, driven insane by ridicule, not to be comforted even by his loyal but unromantic squire Sancho Panza. They drove to the village of Camp de Criptano to see the famous windmills, those structures that, from a distance, Don Quixote believed were menacing giants. Watkin, Dot, and Lay took in castles and museums. Watkin and Dot then took a short flight down to Seville, which was reportedly the town where Cervantes first envisioned his epic story. There they visited cathedrals and parks and watched flamenco dancers perform their intricate movements in the street. "I worked like a dog," Watkin said. He read and reread the novel, looking for the right set of elements that, when combined, would make a compelling screen treatment. But this assignment only lasted a few months before, once again, Walt shelved the project. Even though Walt loved the novel, he could see that the story was simply too difficult to arrange into a 2-hour movie. "Larry," Walt said, "we've got to get a hold of the horse," which meant that Watkin's plot ideas were still too disjointed to create a workable script. That evening, Watkin left the studio with frustration bubbling up in his chest. He went home and complained to his wife that Walt had no idea what he was doing. Walt simply couldn't grasp how Cary Grant would be beloved in this role, which would, if produced, perhaps be Disney's highest-grossing film. When Watkin's irritation was spent, his wife moved beside him. "You love Walt, you know you do," she said. "He doesn't love me," Watkin replied. "He's our friend," Dot continued. "When has he shown you, or the rest of us, anything but kindness?" "He's incapable of friendship," Watkin countered, crossing his arms. But by the following day, after the initial wave of frustration had receded, Watkin could see that Walt more or less was right. He hadn't been able to capture the magic of Cervantes' novel into an outline that would become a workable script. Walt then put Watkin on another project, one that would expand out the Disney live-action features being developed in North America. By this point, Disney had released to great praise 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, a feature partially shot on location, largely in Jamaica and the Bahamas, but also on the Disney lot and the lot over at 20th Century Fox. Disney had also released a quiet, low-budget picture, The Littlest Outlaw, which had been shot in Mexico. Watkin was given the Rebel Raiders project, later called The Great Locomotive Chase, the story of a part-time military spy and a handful of military volunteers from the North who try to destroy the railroad between Atlanta and Chattanooga, thereby cutting off a key supply line used by the Confederate Army. As Walt explained it, the film would be the story of 20-some-odd fellows that went down there and tried to steal this train and wreck these bridges. The men on this mission, nearly all of them Union soldiers, would carefully move down below the Southern line with a plan to steal a train and travel from station to station, bridge to bridge, cutting telegraph wire, tearing up track, and taking down at least one major bridge. The soldiers believed that their plan, if successful, would divide the Confederate Army in half, stopping Southern generals from easily moving equipment, supplies, and troops into and out of Atlanta. The men on the mission, or at least 6 who survived, became the first recipients of the Congressional Medal of Honor. It was a tale of history that, in the first half of the 20th century, was often taught in public schools. The familiarity of the topic, the Disney team believed, would help with publicity. This film's underlying structure would mimic that of the UK films. The story, as it was a significant event in the Civil War, would have a quick audience recognition both in America and overseas. It would be shot in part in the same locations where the historical events happened. It would have one lead star designed to carry the project. For 3 of the UK films, that actor had been Richard Todd. Now for the first on-location US film, it would be Texas native Fess Parker, riding a wave of fame from his recent appearance as Davy Crockett on the Disney TV show. He would play the mission's leader, James Andrews. "Oh, I'm having a fine time with this role of Andrews," Parker said, "even though I'm a Southern boy playing a Yankee Raider." In conversations with Watkin and others on his staff, Walt appeared aware that he was applying some of Roy's selection criteria to this new U.S. project. For the public, Walt would later express independence, saying that he and his studio have completely ignored Hollywood formulas and haven't even tried to be part of them. But when he was developing early live-action features, he was conscious of how new Disney projects worked with, or sometimes against, trends in Hollywood. Like the earlier UK films, The Great Locomotive Chase was another historical drama. It also played into film genres and plot structures that were then working well for other studios. This film is almost like a Western, Walt said. Recent Westerns, such as Hondo with John Wayne and Shane with Alan Ladd, had performed extremely well at the box office. Walt also explained that Watkin's script, once finished, would be arranged around a familiar Hollywood trope. "It's a chase film," he said. It was also a war picture, though not one about World War II. In the early to mid-1950s, films about America's involvement in the recent war continued to play to large audiences, including From Here to Eternity, Mr. Roberts, and The Sea Chase. Behind each of these projects, even if not included in their on-screen materials, was an understanding of how the war had decimated the world, bringing about the deaths of about 75 million people, some in horrific ways. A Civil War picture about events nearly a century old would allow Disney to engage the public's interest in war pictures while distancing their story from familiar and disturbing images of World War II. In short, The Great Locomotive Chase was an extremely well-considered entry point for Disney's first full live-action historical drama produced in America. It spoke to popular film conventions of the mid-1950s, such as the Western genre, the chase plot, and the wartime subject. Yet, by choosing a story set in 1862 as part of America's fabled past, it gave the studio the ability to arrange their materials with family-friendly elements. Walt believed the one possible shortcoming was that this story was utterly devoid of romance, something that was then considered important to attract female viewers. But he also believed that the audience, both men and women, would be so involved with the characters on screen and their mission to wreck train bridges that no one would notice that the film was a little soft on the matter of love. As Watkin started work on the script, the project still needed a producer, which was a problem. Following Rob Roy, Walt and Perce Pierce had a difficult dinner, where Pierce drank too much and brought up an old grievance against his boss, a minor side project he'd once wanted to co-invest in with Walt. Pierce's wife said that over the course of that uncomfortable meal, her husband had made some unflattering comments to Walt. The end result was that Pierce was fired, at least for a little while, likely to put him in his place. Walt intended to rehire him for another North American picture, then in early pre-production, a film called Westward Ho the Wagons. This was another project with a late 1956 release date, but before all that could be worked out, Pierce died of a heart attack. Disney's story artist Dick Humer recalled, "We got word that poor Perce had suddenly dropped dead of a heart attack at our London office. He just sat down at his desk and died." Watkin himself heard that Pierce died in his sleep. Regardless, Pierce passed on July 4, 1955, as Watkin was still finalizing the script for the Great Locomotive Chase and as Walt was getting ready to open Disneyland. Though Pierce was the oldest member of the core UK team, he was only 56 at the time of his passing. It's possible, even likely, that Walt believed that Perce Pierce might act as producer on the Great Locomotive Chase as well, but if so, this plan fell apart right as the project needed a producer. Regardless of the reasons, Walt assigned Bill Walsh, a Disney TV producer, to take over Westward Ho as his first theatrical feature, and Walt asked Larry Watkin, as he'd worked side by side with Pierce in the UK, to take on the role of producer for the Great Locomotive Chase. For Watkin, this offer didn't feel like a promotion, at least not one he wanted. He had never imagined himself as anything but a writer and had difficulty seeing himself as a producer, with all of the planning, bookkeeping, and oversight. For years, he had watched how directors and even Walt had sidelined Perce Pierce, letting him know that on a Disney project, a producer was mostly a person to communicate Walt's wishes and to manage the books. This type of work wasn't particularly appealing for Watkin. He also understood that he would have hardly any authority on the set, as he had no experience as a producer or even as an assistant producer. He took these concerns to Walt, but then Walt, lifting his eyebrows in encouragement, explained that there were ways for a new producer to create authority. "If you pick the director," Walt advised. Watkin understood immediately. If he hired the director, ideally a director without much experience, the director would see Watkin as his supervisor and would likely be grateful for the opportunity. "Go out and pick one," Walt added. Reluctantly, Watkin agreed to take on this assignment, then set about to locating a suitable director. Watkin understood the parameters. Essentially, the director needed to be a person who would bring Walt's vision to the screen without interjecting too much of his own style into the film. Walt's philosophy was to spend money on lead talent, essentially, as Watkin put it, to milk the lead actor for all he's worth, and then to save money on the director. When there was a limited budget, as there almost always was on a Disney project, Walt believed that this strategy would produce the best possible film. Watkin picked Pete Lyon, a longtime film editor who had only recently tried his hand at directing mostly for TV. This was the exact type of person who Walt would pick, someone without a lot of baggage and with very little ego, also someone who very likely would defer to Watkin on key decisions concerning the production. According to Fess Parker, Walt often promoted people into positions slightly outside of their reach as a way of maintaining control at the studio, as less experienced individuals would naturally defer to him. Walt wanted the last word. He didn't want anybody to challenge him, Parker said. "I saw people come to the studio, people Walt had hired to do huge, difficult projects, who had never done a simple project. Larry Watkin, the producer of the Great Locomotive Chase, is a good example." The goal, according to Parker, was for Walt to have control in the editing room to give a project its final narrative shape. This was a lesson Walt had learned on Treasure Island, but even in this, Watkin understood Walt's motivation. It was in the cutting room that the old-time producers like Disney were truly great, Watkin said. They could cut, splice, turn whole sequences around in the most amazing fashion, often telling a slightly different story with the material at hand. Watkin's role now, in addition to writing the script, was to simply get the picture shot in such a way that Walt and studio editors would have strong options once he brought the film back to Burbank. Once on location in Georgia, Watkin discovered that producing a Disney picture meant managing a very tight budget. There was money enough to hire a few leads, but after that the producer needed to get creative. There wasn't enough money to hire suitable actors to go around, Watkin said, so I turned to local talent to fill in the gaps. In other words, Watkin followed the playbook that he and Pierce had established in London for the UK features. For minor roles, Watkin hired a local mayor and also the owner of a restaurant. For one of the children's roles, that of a station switchman, Watkin hired Doug Bleckley, a well-meaning 13-year-old who served him ice cream at a lunch counter a few weeks before filming began. As producer, Watkin needed to oversee location development, set construction, and the procurement of train equipment. Though the two trains, the Texas and the General, in the actual Civil War events still existed, Disney used similar trains as the real ones were deemed too valuable to be used in a motion picture. To increase the film's sense of visual accuracy, Watkin employed 73-year-old Wilbur Kurtz, a historian who had come to Atlanta in 1903 specifically to research the Locomotive incident. A few years later, he also married one of the daughters of the Southern man who eventually stopped the raid. Kurtz was key to making sure the events on screen matched the historical record. As the story largely took place on two trains, with one train of Southerners chasing another train carrying raiders from the north, Disney rented a stretch of the Tallulah Falls Railroad, which cut through the center of Georgia. It was an old regional line, then used by only one train, which ran at night. Along the tracks, the Disney team built train stations, made in the fashion of those from the mid-1800s, with the paint and signs carefully aged. They found high-wheel pushcarts and southern carpet bags, as well as round-top trunks from the previous century. Woodworkers created replica boxcars that could be destroyed and burned during production. Another team set up telegraph poles positioned next to the track for as far as the camera could see. For scenes where the raiders tore up the track, throwing rails and spikes into the weeds, Disney used the actual track of the Tallulah Falls Railroad, which was acceptable to the owners so long as each rail was carefully put back by nightfall before that one commercial train made its way along the route. The film premiered in Atlanta at a 2-day event to honor the film and Walt Disney. Over the previous few years, with the opening of Disneyland and the weekly Disney TV show, Walt had become a far larger celebrity than he'd been the previous decade. On Thursday, June 7th, locals decorated the ballroom at the Dinkler Plaza Hotel so that it resembled 4 of the themed lands at Disneyland: Adventureland, Frontierland, Fantasyland, and Tomorrowland. Guests were invited to wear masks of Disney characters or, alternatively, carry an image or a stuffed animal of their favorite Disney character. Walt and Lillian attended, as did Fess Parker and the other stars of the movie. The following night, the Great Locomotive Chase had its premiere at Lowe's Grand, a 2,000-seat theater located in the heart of the city. The film was well received and profitable. But after all was said and done, Watkin didn't continue as producer on other Disney projects. He discovered that he liked words, not financial reports. He enjoyed historic research far more than overseeing the construction of historic sets. But his experience on the Great Locomotive Chase helped him better understand the process of making a live-action feature, knowledge that guided his efforts on later scripts, including one that would eventually be viewed as one of Walt's most significant live-action films. I'll be back next week with a new episode. Also, over on Bandcamp, I'm starting to move more multi-part series into albums. This will let you play the entire series directly with one click. As Bandcamp sends out a notice when each new album is posted, I'm only combining these up once a week. This week, I'm combining up a series called Television Technology at a Disney Park in Palm Beach, which is the story of how Disney helps shepherd in color TV in the early 1960s, and also in a related venture, how it nearly builds a new theme park just north of Miami, very close to the beach. So if you're on Bandcamp, you likely got a message about this album this morning, in addition to the episode you just listened to about Larry Watkin and Walt Disney. As you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We do just two things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and the parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. We are funded entirely by listener contributions, specifically by listeners who join us on Bandcamp as monthly subscribers. On Bandcamp, you'll find over 200 episodes not available on iTunes or anywhere else. But the best reason to join us there is to support the work we do here and to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can support us by becoming a monthly subscriber at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. As usual, I'll leave that link down in our show notes. So, until next week, this is Todd James Pierce.